the idea is like 1% of the equation,
Right.
right? It's like, in fact, most of the times in the last 30 years of doing fantasy sports, there's maybe I can count maybe 4 or 5 times there's ever been an original idea that someone's come to me where I've been like, whoa, I never thought about that before. A great idea. Almost everything has been thought of before or some iteration of it.
Right.
And it's the people haven't been able to pull it off for a certain reason, right? The timing wasn't right, or they just didn't go about it the right way, or there was some big hurdle they couldn't overcome.
Hey everyone, welcome to the How I Got Here podcast. I'm your host, Trevis Waters, and I designed this podcast to share stories that are worth telling, whether it's about somebody going from zero to hero, hero to zero, or simply something in between. On today's episode, we're joined by Peter of RotoWire. We learn about one of the OGs of fantasy sports, how he started in the markets, the Wall Street side of things, how he eventually got into sports and player news, and got all the way to where he is now today. Let's go ahead and jump into our conversation with him now. Enjoy. Hey guys, welcome to the How I Got Here podcast. I'm your host, Trevis Waters, and joined with me on this episode, we have Peter of RotoWire. Now, I didn't mention this to you before we started recording, but you were actually the first episode of season 2. So we finally got into our next season, and for those who may have not heard of you by name or by face, I'm sure if they've been anywhere in the fantasy sports and sports betting space, they've heard of RotoWire, but kind of just do like a quick 10 to 15 second overview of, I guess, of just who you are. Where are you now in 2025?
Peter Schoenke, still head up RotoWire, which is now owned by Gambling.com Group. But I started it back in 1997 with two friends from college and have been doing it ever since. And along the way, I've been a big part of the FSTA and then FSGA trade industry, helping lead up. I was the chairman for a long time and mostly helped lead the legislative affairs and everything that's been going on with the government and things like that. So that's it in a nutshell. Probably said not that well. So.
Nah, you're good. So how we like starting off our episodes is for you to peel back as far in your memory that your memory allows to the very, very first thing that you remember wanting to be or wanting to do, quote unquote, when you grew up, and kind of how old were you when you had that thought?
Boy, it's going to reveal how old I am, right? So, no, I mean, I've always been, super fascinated by sports statistics. When I was growing up, my friends and I played a lot of wiffle ball, and so I kept all the stats by hand. And at the end of the year, I had everyone's batting average and compiled that every year. And so I was super geeky into stats. This is, really before fantasy sports got going or really became mainstream. It's the 80s. And then I read a lot of Bill James books, when I was in high school and really got into sabermetrics and all that kind of stuff. So, it's always been a passion of mine, forever. But I never thought, certainly when I was in high school or whatever, that I would have it for a job. I certainly never thought there'd be a way to play the way you can play today, where you can, join leagues and draft baseball in December, like I'm doing right now, or win lots of money. All those kinds of things were just inconceivable back then. But I've always been a pretty big fan of that. But when I was growing up, I never really, even though I was super passionate about it, there wasn't really a route to getting a job doing that, right? There wasn't a Stats Inc. If you wanted to be a front office person for a team, you kind of had to have a career, as a former player. I wasn't good enough to be like a pro player. There just wasn't a viable path to be like, oh, I'm going to turn this passion of mine in sports and sports statistics into a career. So that was just something that never really entered my mindset until well after I graduated from college.
So while you had that fascination for the sports statistics, and you had the realization that there's no path, there's no way I could turn this into a full-fledged career, just because based on the opportunities at the time, what were you when you were having okay, I know I can't do this, so I have to look at something I can do. What were the other things you were kind of tossing around that high school time when you found that fascination, or the nerdiness or the geeked outness, as you mentioned, for sports statistics?
Well, I mean, I didn't know really what I wanted to do coming out of high school, right? So then I went to Northwestern, and even there, I don't think I knew what I wanted to do. I majored in economics, but then eventually I started writing for the Daily Northwestern, which is their newspaper. And after a few years, I realized like, oh, journalism's great. I like this. And I wasn't an undergraduate journalism major. But there was the sports section. And at the time, the people who worked for the sports section, we had some real people, some talent, Jay Donde, this guy I work with now, Mike Cates, just really, really, just a lot of prominent people who became people that were known on ESPN and major publications later on, newspapers and stuff like that. But I actually didn't choose sports because I just thought, well, it just seems so limiting. Like I'm gonna have to go cover some sport in some small town that I don't really like to begin with, and what is the ultimate career? So I didn't even choose sports then. I chose and when I was in journalism school, sorry, when I was doing in school and doing journalism, everyone said the way you get a job is if you want to cover numbers of economics or the markets or business. That's how you get a job because no anybody else in journalism school they go to journalism school because they don't like math and they don't like numbers. And I was like, oh, I like that. So after college. I got a job on covering Wall Street, and ultimately for the financial markets, covering the futures and options markets in Chicago for Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal. And so I covered all these financial markets, and that's kind of the genesis for how I came with the idea for Roto News then and RotoWire now.
So I know you said that you started college with the economics degree. Did you finish and graduate with that degree, even though you found that passion for journalism while working on other things during that time?
Yeah, so I graduated in economics, and then I stayed an extra year. I went to grad school, and then I decided, okay, I'm going to make journalism my career. So I stayed for an extra year and got a master's in journalism from Northwestern. So I basically went to the Northwestern for 5 years. It was on the 5 year plan. I'd probably on the 30-year plan if I could, because it was so much fun, right? So I stayed an extra year. But yeah, I stayed graduated in journalism, and then got a job right out of college on Wall Street. I worked for a then publication called the IPO Reporter, which is about IPOs. And after a little while, then I got a job in Chicago, like I said, covering the futures and options markets, actually the credit markets. I worked for Dow Jones Credit Markets Report, which doesn't really exist anymore, but it was a newswire that covered the credit markets, T bond futures, euro dollar futures, all the credit swaps, all that kind of fun stuff back then. Which the stuff that was traded in the pits where they would open outcry, as they called it, where they'd be yelling at each other and things would be going up and going down, and I had to figure out why and write articles about it every day, and that was a lot of fun.
So I know that you were mentioning when you were in college and you had this fascination for journalism while still working on the economics degree. People were telling you, "Hey, if you want to get a career in this, you have to do focus on the markets, focus on these focus on these numbers." And yeah, apparently I don't want to talk today. And so my question is, I know you said you got a job right out of college, but did you see that it was it in line with what people were telling you of how easy it is to get a job? Like, were you a one application? Oh, you know all this stuff. You want to write about this? Perfect. You're hired immediately. Is that kind of how the experience went?
Yes, I got a job right away, and it was because just really more the supply and demand. These publications that cover the markets needed to hire someone, and so I got a job. Whereas my friends who wanted to be more traditional journalists, cover, city government, crime, they struggled to get jobs, and they worked for small papers in kind of the middle of nowhere, which was less appealing. And so it was different, it was a lot of that. I'd like to say, oh, I was awesome and I was like the best journalist, and so I got hired right away, but it was really more just like, hey, you get hired. At that point, you need a job. So I was like, I like finance. I'll work on Wall Street, I'll cover some stuff, and it worked out great.
So, getting the job immediately following graduating college with an economics degree, how long did that, I guess, that time period of your resume extend for? Was it a couple of years? Was it much longer
Yeah, it
than
was about
that?
2 years, really. Um, and then what happened was when I covered the futures markets in Chicago, so on the Chicago Board of Trade and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, where the traders are yelling at each other in the open outcry pits. So this is 1994, 1995. There's no internet at that point, right? So the closest thing to the internet was a Bloomberg terminal. And then there were also competitors. There was ones from Dow Jones and Knight Ridder and some other ones. But Bloomberg was the main one, and it's still something that financial traders use today. But you could go on these terminals and you could type in a stock symbol or a security symbol and get like a graph, what's the latest price, what's the latest headlines related to it, stuff that's just super common, right? You and I can go on the web and probably find 30 sites that does in 3 seconds. But back then, that was, not very common. And so the traders, when they wanted to figure out what was going on or look something up, they would run down to the on the side of the pits, and there were terminals there that were there for they could use, whether it was their company or available for everyone, and they would type in this info. And there are lots of other people around the pits and stuff like that that had those on their actual desk. But it was a way to like look at the markets and figure out info. And I had the idea at the time I wanted to start a business. I wanted to do something on the side, take a shot at it. And I had two friends, one friend in particular, Herbil, one of my co-founders, who was just like, we need to start a business. We need to start a business. And we had a bunch of ideas. He had a bunch of ideas. We had a bunch of ideas. They're all kind of not very good, but because the internet was just getting going. Yahoo had just launched, just gone public or just launched. And so we were like, oh, we got to jump on this train. So we had ideas for like wedding sites and some other stuff, but nothing that really like we thought we could really do. And then I just kind of had the idea of like, well, we play fantasy sports all the time because I was still, I ran all the leagues by hand, typed in the stats by hand. Over the years in college, I started the league with my friends who eventually started the company with, and I did everything by hand. I either just had a spreadsheet for football, got the box score, typed it in, or for baseball, I had my Mac Classic and a spreadsheet in there, and I typed in all of the baseball stats every 2 weeks. That took a lot of time. And so I ran all these leagues. And so, we were super into fantasy sports. And I had the idea of like, well, why don't we create the Bloomberg terminal for fantasy sports, where you can just get all that same kind of info. You type in the player's name, you get the latest news, you look at all the information, and that was just that was a thing that was that was the idea that just made a lot of sense. And there was one site service in particular. So in addition to the Bloomberg terminal, you could buy like subscription services on top of the Bloomberg terminal. And there was one that was called, I can't remember what it was called. It was like MCM Market Watch or something. And the second the news came out, so like they released jobs data or inflation data, they went on there really quick and they typed up a really quick synopsis of what that meant. Well, we're looking at the PPI today, and even though the top number says looks really bad, if you look at the underlying metrics, blah blah blah, and then they'd put it out really fast. Again, something on the internet today is probably like, it's on Twitter or something like that in 3 seconds. But I thought, okay, well, let's also do that. So in addition to reporting what the news is, also have our quick take on what it is. And so we launched Player News, really kind of as the core of the site when we launched the site in February of 1990, or January of 1997. And that was really the tool that we came up with. That was really the even to this day still the thing that is the main draw for then Roto News and now RotoWire, which is the player news, in terms of what happened, what the news is, whether it's her transaction called up, and then kind of a quick spin on what that means. Like you should go pick up this player because obviously this guy's going to get called up from AAA, or this guy's injured in the NFL, so go pick up this wide receiver because he's going to suddenly get a whole bunch of balls thrown his way, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of quick explanation of how the whole thing kind of came together. Obviously, there's a lot more involved in that, but that was the genesis of it all.
So I'm curious. I know you said that when you were talking with your co-founder, you both have a lot of ideas. You said you were most of them weren't great ideas, but I'm curious if you look back to that period in retrospect, being in the mid to late '90s, what was one of the ideas that if you guys went with that instead, based on the timing of mid to late '90s, that you're like, oh, if we actually did that one would have crushed based on like how technology has developed since then. I mean, of course, I'm not saying everybody knows RotoWire
It's
crushed. I'm
hard.
saying
It's
from the
hard to remember
second
all
it
the
hit.
ideas we had. I mean, like so, like one of the ideas that we had was that Herb, his one of his sisters got married, and he went there, and he was like, "Oh my gosh, there's so much planning and everything like that. We should invent this website online about for weddings and all that kind of stuff. It's such a huge opportunity." And then we looked into it, and there was a site that had just launched called The Knot, right, and which is still very big,
Yeah.
for that. And so we were like, well, that one's not really, that's not an opportunity. Somebody's already ahead of us. And we're not the people to probably do that, right? Like we had zero stuff. But it's just more like that. It was more ideas of like, oh, what's a big market that's not on the internet that's something we could do? But a lot of the ideas, I don't think I have like some great idea that like, oh, we had the idea for Facebook, but we didn't do Facebook at the time or something like that. I wish I could say that we did that, but not really. I mean, there's probably a lot of winners that we had, but it's also like one thing I know from running the companies and looking at stuff and leading the FSTA and FSGA and talking to a lot of startups. The idea is like 1% of the equation,
Right.
right? It's like, in fact, most of the times in the last 30 years of doing fantasy sports, there's maybe I can count maybe 4 or 5 times there's ever been an original idea. that someone's come to me where I've been like, whoa, I never thought about that before. Great idea. Almost everything has been thought of before, or some iteration of it.
Right.
And it's the people haven't been able to pull it off for a certain reason, right? The timing wasn't right, or they just didn't go about it the right way, or there was some big hurdle they couldn't overcome. And so the idea is just such a small part of it. It's all about the execution and how you do it. So a lot of those ideas we had, even if we had come up with Facebook or whatever or something ahead of time, and we were like way ahead of the curve on something like that, I don't know that we would have been the ones to execute it, right? Because it's just we wouldn't have known all the ingredients to put into it. Whereas for fantasy sports, we were the ones to execute that because we were super passionate about it. We've been played for a long time. I had experience now for how you cover a real-time market, how you do the journalism behind that. And so that worked out really well. And then we had the passion to get it through the first couple of years, which were, very trying times. I mean, we weren't making any money. And, I think, a lot of the time we didn't even really know if it was going to be an endeavor we were going to continue to do, so it was very much a side project. So, that's the part that really makes it so that you can be successful as a business. And I see a lot of people in the industry whenever they come to me and they say, I have this idea, almost always the cardinal sin or the major error is when they think the idea is everything. I always like to say that your business idea is inversely proportional to your desire for an NDA. Like if you came to me and said, "Hey, I have this great idea, and I need you to sign an NDA before I can even talk to you about my startup," you're dead. Like I would say, like 99 out of 100 times, maybe even more, that person has no chance because that person thinks the idea is so important, right? They just think it's like, I can't even share with anyone because that's the idea is what's gonna make me all the money. And it's just not like that at all, and 9 times out of 10, or maybe more, I've already heard of the idea. It's some stock market futures thing or some game or something, or whatever. It's like, it's there's a reason why it hasn't succeeded before. So
No, I appreciate that golden nugget of knowledge there. It's something that within like all of these episodes that we do, we like kind of pulling those things out. So that's definitely a great learning point to anybody that is in the, I mean, I guess you could say like the pre-revenue concept stage is, yeah, I mean, that NDA thing makes complete sense as well. So a question I had going back to 97 with player news, when like the first iteration of this, was this just you kind of scraping, I mean, not even you're scraping from the internet at that point, but like scraping through all these different newspaper articles to see like what's going on, what's happening here, or like the magazines that were out at the time, and then you were the one that's manually inputting all of these updates? Or how did the very first version essentially work with player news?
yeah, I mean, to give you an idea about, let's go back to 1997, January of 1997, and it'll seem like we're talking about like the Civil War or like Roman and Greek times compared to how old it is, but. Um, if you were managing a fantasy baseball team, and let's just say that you had on your roster the fourth outfielder for the San Diego Padres, how would you ever find out information about that player? You would get a box score in the newspaper, and sometimes on the West Coast it might not even be in that night's paper. You might have to get it like a day later. If you looked in the box score and you saw that that player played or didn't play or had one at bat left, you would be like, what happened to that player? Well, your sources of information were very limited. Maybe on ESPN that night, on Baseball Tonight or ESPN, they would talk about that player and like if he was injured or something like that, that you'd see that. That's pretty rare, right? Especially if it's not like a star player. Maybe, there would be some publication somewhere, USA Today, for example, I think maybe like once a week or twice a week, they had little note columns on every team. So they'd say San Diego Padres, and they'd have like one line. This guy got called up. This guy was injured. Maybe it would be in there. So it was extremely hard, to find information on players. Right now, you find it 3 seconds on Twitter or whatever, right? And so what we would do is we would just scour, not only the internet, but we would like, get every print publication we had. We'd subscribe to them, all this kinds of stuff, and we would put it in there, just like you said. And it just, even though there'd be a huge lag in terms of when we get it, it would still be ahead of the curve. So one example I always give is I lived in Chicago. Our offices were downtown. I would get on the L. At the L, I would buy the newspaper, like especially the USA Today when they had the notes section. And on my L ride, I'd take out a pen and paper, and I mean a pen, and I would circle all the stuff that was like new. I'd get to the office. I'd look online. I'd be like, oh, do we have an update on this guy? No, we don't. Well, USA Today says, he left the game with an injury and put it in there. And think about the lag time on that. That could be like 2 days after he got injured, a whole, 3 whatever hours it is until I finally got to it that day. And people on the internet were like, "This is the greatest thing ever. Oh my God, I can actually figure out what's going on." It's like this information is so fast, you know. So that was kind of the beginning of it, which just seems, like I said, it just seems like prehistoric times. And then eventually it just got faster and faster. More newspapers came online, so then we were able to access the papers online. Initially they didn't they didn't release the articles until like 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. because they didn't want to disfavor the people that got the print ones. So we'd be up in the middle of the night doing that. Then eventually, that the beat writers, the people who covered the teams, they had a blog, so they might post something during the day. We had access to all those blogs, we tracking those, and then eventually Twitter came along, and all this other social media platforms, and so we had to follow that. And obviously, Twitter is what probably drives most of the news nowadays. But throughout the, having knowing where to, get all these reports and who's doing what and who are the beat writers and what are the mediums, and in this market they might release their data on a blog or talk on local radio. That was part of the equation to figure out where we could get all the data and where it could be ahead of time. And yeah, we just, we never were the reporters ourselves. We were just the people out there. And even today, we're not breaking news or sending people to games. We're just eyes and ears everywhere and gathering all this info. And I like to say that even back then and still today, we're not doing anything that you can't do yourself. But who has the time to sit there and, 24 hours a day or 12 hours a day or whatever time you can put into it to scour the internet, read every newspaper, find a little bit of info? You could do it, but that's not your time is not best served that way. You know what I mean? You want to make decisions. You don't want to be the person that's spending 8 hours to go find some nugget. So we save people a lot of time. And that was the case back then and still the case today.
Yeah, convenience. That's what it's all about. So, two questions that stem from that. The first one is, I know you mentioned early on that you guys didn't create some monetized version of this, and so you weren't making money at the beginning. When you and your co-founders created the first edition, or the first few editions anyway, of Player News, were you guys still doing were you doing your Wall Street or your market jobs still while working on this baby, or was it just I'm just going to fully commit, and whenever we start making money, we start making money?
Yeah, it was kind of a hodgepodge. I just full out quit, and just said I'm going all in. And at the time, I was single, didn't have any kids. I figured if I could pay for my rent and beer, I'd probably be fine. I also was probably pretty cocky in that, like, well, I'll give it a shot. And if after a year or so it doesn't work out, I'll just go get another job. I'll get another job right in front of their publication or something like that. Like who knows if I really could have, but I felt like I had had a lot of connections and had shown that I was a good reporter and I could get hired again. So maybe that was a little egotistical, but whatever. It gave me the guts, I guess, to go out and try it. And then my partners, Chip Erickson, who still is our main radio host and talent, editor today, and Herbil, they still had jobs. And at the time, Erickson was in college. He just finished. He was in law school, so he was trying to go to law school and juggle part-time jobs and do this on the side. And Herb had a job, and he quit that job and went in. But it was kind of over like the first like 2 years. It was kind of like um, we didn't, we not, we, there are pluses and minuses to doing it the way we did. We basically bootstrapped it, right? Which meant that we were kind of off and on, getting a part-time job when we needed money and then doing this. It probably would have been better if we would have raised a bunch of money. We didn't know how to do that. I have no, if we were not skilled or educated in how to be an entrepreneur. And it was also just way, way harder in the 90s than it is now. Just exponentially harder, just so much harder to do that kind of stuff. The positive was that, we didn't have investors. We didn't have people that were, you know, uh, we didn't, yelling at us all the time. Where's my return? We didn't have all that kind of pressure. So we kind of could feel our way out and do it at our own pace and figure things out and that way. Whereas if we'd raised money, maybe we would have burned through that cash and done some dumb things and had people, yelling at us or felt pressure that way. And we didn't do that. The flip side is when you raise money and you go the venture route and do all that, you also get a lot of connections and coaching and people and stuff like that. And we didn't have that at all. So That's kind of what you lose, going that direction. But yeah, we just basically bootstrapped it. In the first couple of years were just kind of crazy until finally we got to about 1998, late 1998, early 1999, and that's when we were all in and just decided to do it full time.
So you kind of already answered this question more or less because you mentioned, Twitter and all these other social apps and everything that came out of the woodwork that expedited uh, the news coming out essentially. So because you launched so early into the internet existence, how often from 97 and I don't know, let's just say like the next 5 or 6 years, how often were you guys changing what player news was because of how quickly technology is expeditedly growing, I guess you could say, during that time period? Was it like, oh man, this like internet's 1,000 times faster? Or you mentioned before, like, oh, all the news articles are now on the internet. We don't need to go buy them anymore. How much of what player news was version 1.0, how often that shift based on the technological advancements of the time?
I mean, certainly like the resources of what we use to find the news changed all the time, and we had to be on top of that. And the way we delivered the news definitely changed a little bit, in terms of the website being faster and then eventually like there being like mobile and all that kind of stuff and text alerts back in the day, like being like one of the first things we ever did. We were one of the first people that ever had, or companies that ever had text alerts, this is way back before when cell phones were getting going. But it really was more about the how you make money in the industry with whatever product you had that was changing. Early on, like no one knew how to do anything, in terms of like it was just how to make money. I remember there was a time I met this guy. He worked for the company that owned the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and he owned a site that was called fastball.com. And it was at the time, it was an awesome site. It was way ahead of the time. It had the AP Newswire for baseball online, which of course now it's like a dime a dozen, but back then he was like the first one. And then we had our stuff, and we were going to do this collaboration. We were going to put our player notes on his page, and nowadays you figure out the economics of that. But I remember we had a meeting, and he was like, "Oh yeah, how much are you going to pay me to put your stuff on my site?" And I was like, "Wait, how much are you going to? Am I going to pay you to put stuff on your site? You're going to pay me for other stuff." And so there just wasn't really a whole there's just even if you had like an awesome site that had lots of traffic, it just wasn't clear how you made money back then, right? And all the sites were losing money. They just had lots of traffic and they figured they'd make money on advertising. And that's kind of what we did. But that's the stuff that shifted a lot, the early days, trying to figure out like what would make money. Could we syndicate our data to ESPN? Could we sell it on advertising? Could we, have a subscription product? Um, that's the stuff that for the first 3 to 5 years of the business was just all over the map. And then eventually we settled just because we were out of any other ways to get money after the dot-com bubble crashed. So this is 1999, 2000, 2001. So after 2001, when it finally crashed, the ad rates that you could get for advertising, they went down like 90% or something. I mean, it was kind of nuts. And so we were like, we just, we need money to keep doing this. So we started to decide to charge. So we charged for our player news and our service, which at the time was just totally radical. I mean, we were probably one of the first information sites, not just in fantasy, but I mean, really on the internet, that decided to do that. That was March of 2001. And it worked, or no, sorry, that was, take that back. That was September of 2001, or it was right after 9/11. So it was like September or October of 2001. And it worked like a charm. It worked great. People actually paid for it. Suddenly we could forecast our cash flow and we could do things and we could see there was return, and it worked out great. But before that, it wasn't really possible. Like if you would go back to like 98, 99, that wasn't really possible. It was really hard to pay online. People were not really willing to, conceive of how you pay for something online. Just, but then eventually you had PayPal and all kinds of stuff. And eventually it just became a lot easier. But those early days were very, very difficult. And I see that a lot in other industries right now. I mean, all kinds of new stuff that's out there. Some new, lots of times it's just there's not really a definable way to make money, and eventually that it settles on that, and it comes to fruition a bit more. And so for us, after we shifted to a pay model in 2001, we just kind of never looked back. It just worked out, and you can vary it a little bit. You have advertising, some stuff for free, some stuff for pay, but it just became a way more sustainable model, and from that point on, the business became just a lot more manageable and stable and just kept growing.
It's always a positive feeling that you created something that has so much value that somebody's willing to pay for it. I don't mean, I guess not necessarily asking this as a question, more rhetorical, is like how, like, the thought process that goes behind, like, okay, we need to make money, but how do we price it at a point where not just one person signs up for it and we get enough revenue that we can continue this going. So we're in 2001 now. That's essentially, that's when you in the fall is when you kind of start creating this subscription model. From there, moving on as forward as possible, how many years was that essentially the, like, okay, whatever we had in October when we launched the monetization side, this is now how the company works, and just pumping on all cylinders, growing user base, growing paid customers. What point in the future, whether it's a few years down the road or many years down the road, did that shift into something beyond that, where it was in October 2001?
I mean, after that, it just, we had some up years and some down years, but it was pretty just steadily upward. And part of that was also just the fantasy sports industry around that time also got in a lot more solid footing. So you had the CDM case, which if you're watching this don't know, I mean, at the time in the like 2000, 2, 3, 4, 5, there were a lot of unknowns for fantasy sports. One was the CDM's case, which was that if you had a fantasy sports game and you're using the player names with part of the statistics, who did you have to pay the players? Did you have to pay the player unions? It was a real overhang for the whole industry because people were afraid to launch games and contests because they'd have to go to the player unions to get approval, and there was no set cost. So it's really hard to like say, hey, we're going to start this new fantasy football game or baseball game and build it, but we might have to go to the player union. We don't know what the cost is. We don't know if they're going to approve us. So it's hard to raise money, right? And so eventually, CDM Sports won a case, in court, which the industry supported, so that the player names, as part of the statistics, you didn't have to pay the players for the right of publicity. It's just part of the statistics. That was really a big deal for the fantasy sports industry, and that was 2006, I guess, when it finally got going. The other thing was just the legality of it all, right? There's always kind of a unknown. And the UEJA, which was an act that came out in the mid 2000s that had a specific carve out for fantasy sports, so that while it wasn't the actual federal law on it all, it was the first time the federal government had weighed in on fantasy sports and said that at least for banking transactions, if you're going to do a banking transaction and put your money through something online, while sports betting at the time was banned, you couldn't do it. If a fantasy game fit this criteria, that was legal. So that was great. That suddenly alleviated a lot of pressure in the industry. Again, if you're trying to raise money for a game or a contest or a subscription site for content, there's all this cloud that got lifted. And then the leagues themselves, they were very anti-fantasy sports. I mean, when we started the business, Major League Baseball, the NFL, culturally, they did not like fantasy. They did not embrace it. But then eventually and the NFL in particular did a study in the early 2000s, and it revealed that fantasy sports, fantasy football players were actually their best consumers. Like they went to more games, they watched more TV, most importantly. They did everything. They bought more jerseys. Any way you looked at it, they were their best consumers. And then suddenly the NFL just flipped, and they went from being anti-fantasy as something that was geeky and quasi gambling, and they didn't like it, to where they were like, oh, this is actually a hobby that's really going to benefit us. And so things turned. And then as a result, you saw major media organizations like ESPN and CBS and whatnot got involved in fantasy and embraced it, and got suddenly had programming on it later. But all of that turned in the middle of that decade. And so RotoWire, to get back to the point, we kind of rode that wave too. I mean, part of it's, yes, we were good, we were ahead of the time, we were successful, but you also have to be kind of an industry that's doing well, as well, and we did. And so luckily, all of those things kind of aligned. We like to say we played a part in some of that, I mean, and influencing a lot of it, especially on the regulatory side in terms of working with the big media companies and things like that. So we played a part, but there were these big industry trends that also helped us a lot. So, even to this day, it's still that way where, fantasy and all this kind of stuff keeps growing. But back in the, 2001 to 2010 range, it was just a real boom time for the industry.
Question. So earlier in this video, the show, you mentioned FSGA, FSTA a few times, and I know that people may not recognize you by face, even though you've been on like televised court proceedings, moving
Yeah.
the industry along. So because of this big shift of these leagues now backing fantasy football and fantasy sports in general, what point of your career with RotoWire from this entire trip did you essentially start becoming I don't know, not saying like a face of the industry, but vocalizing yourself within the industry and becoming something that like, hey, like we need to move this industry forward and I want to be part of that. When did that start happening?
Well, that started pretty much at the inception of the FSTA, which was 1990, I think it was 1998. It was, it's kind of like a little murky because there was always the USA Today labor drafts, which still exist today. But that was like the only industry meeting back in like the 90s, until like 97, 98. So a bunch of people met at that and talked about, having an industry, association or whatever. And so pretty much right at in the inception, I think I maybe wasn't there for like the very first meeting ever, but for the most part, I was like, I want to be involved and I want to see what's going on. So yeah, just basically from the early days, just being part of that. A lot of that was just being somebody that just showed up to all the meetings and, attended all the conferences and just tried to meet everyone and try to figure out where the industry was going and how we could help out, how we could play a part and what issues we needed to tackle. And it was a great group of people at the time. Charlie Wiegert, Greg Ambrosius, Rob Pythian. Um, those early days, it wasn't like huge companies, huge budgets. I mean, a lot of people just put in time, and we just tried to figure out a lot of these industry issues, like the CD, like the player unions, how we could overcome that or find some compromise with them, at least initially, and then eventually, when they didn't want to compromise, how we could, take, what we could do collectively to help, Charlie and CDM in the court case. So yeah, I just got really, that's part of the reason that RotoWire is what it is today is the FSTA, which is now the FSGA, and just building the business on top of the relationships that I and other people from RotoWire met, figured how to work together, how to work with a company like ESPN when they're launching their product, and just all those kinds of things. So it was just it's just a lot of you know participation and just trying to put our heads together to how to figure out how to do things better. And it was great. I mean, a lot of these companies and people were competitors. They were RotoWorld or doing their own player notes. I mean, Fanball and Rob Pythian had player notes at the time, and so but there was never really that cutthroat aspect. It was just all of us loved the hobby and we wanted it to be something that the mainstream media and the leagues themselves would embrace, because and it was just a very much we're all together in this. How can we grow the industry? And if we know we can grow the industry bigger, we're all going to benefit. And that's ended up what happening. I talked to all those people. They're all very successful, successful companies, a lot of successful exits. Rob Pythian, I think, started too many companies for me to even remember now at this point. But I think everyone had a really good attitude in terms of like the path to victory here is how do we grow the industry and make it mainstream, and then as a result, all of us will benefit. And so there's just a lot of cooperation to try to figure out how to solve some of these bigger problems.
I think chronologically we caught up to about you said about the middle of the first part of the 2000s anyway, which I believe was the time period you were mentioning where the league started being like, oh hey, this is good for business. Let's actually start backing this and create our own product. So now we're kind of focusing on the second half of the first decade of the 2000s. Did anything besides that big shift, which of course the league backs it, that's extremely important, and we saw the same thing happen a decade and a half-ish later with sports betting, where like, oh, you can't talk about sports betting, and now, oh, hey, we're the title partner. DraftKings is our main backer, and all the stuff that happened from there. So it's very interesting how many parallels there are with how the sports betting industry has grown in parallel with what you're talking about the fantasy sports industry during this time. So what other shifts were happening, whether it's the space or it's RotoWire in general? I would say now we're kind of looking at like the 2010
Yeah, I think
time
when
period.
you got more to the end of the decade, it's really more about the technology.
Yeah.
Like the cell phone, the iPhone came out. A lot of the technology in terms of like the real-time stats and everything just got faster and better. And so a lot of these games and contests, you're able to figure out new games. And so when you get to like 2008, 9, 10, you start having daily fantasy sports. And that was really the thing that just, was sort of the next thing that took off for the industry. And just the size, the number of contests you could have, the number of people playing, the fact that you could use your phone to track all the stats, that just kind of took everything off, and it was another wave that I think if you went back to like 2007, 8, and talked to me or someone in the industry, they wouldn't have really foreseen coming. Certainly they knew the technology was getting better and the iPhone was going to probably make a big difference. But the rise of daily fantasy sports was just a real game changer. Starting in 2009, 2010, when FanDuel at first, FanDuel wasn't the very first, but they were the first mainstream company that just took it to a new level, and obviously that just took fantasy sports to a whole new level of participation and money that had never happened before.
Something I want to go back to that you said earlier is you're talking about your younger egotistical self, where you knew, hey, if this doesn't work out, this sucks. I can easily get a job back where in the same niche that I was kind of working in. Was that mindset, which I don't think there's anything necessarily bad with that. It's just you know your skill set, you have the resume, it's probably not going to be that hard to find another job. But did that same version of Peter arrive now that we're in, I believe, around the 2010 mark, where you just mentioned there's so much changing on the technical outlook of, all these apps are coming out, everything's so much faster. Did you have the same mindset of like whatever the world's technology brings my way, we can adapt and we will overcome whatever advancements happen? Or did you and your team have any like little bit of fear, like, holy crap, like there's this stuff is getting crazy quick. I don't know if we have the capability of keeping up with the time, so to speak. So which version of Peter was more prevalent
We
there
were
at the
always pretty
time?
nimble. I mean, it was the latter. I mean, it was or the former, I guess. It was always, kept to this day, it still keeps the job fun. There's always some new technology and some new twist and, some way to try to get ahead of the curve, because you're going to be the first one to have text alerts, on your phone, or you're going to be the first one to have a mobile app, or, there's this new game format it comes out for daily. Are we going to be able to be the ones to provide information for that? Like, how do you take our projections and apply to it? So that always kept the job fun. It was just, it never got stale because there was always some new challenge to try to be ahead of the curve on, and it's still, I mean, still that way today as well. But yeah, that's the way it was, and things were changing pretty quickly, but that made it great. So yeah, I was fully embracing it.
When we go from the later half of the decade to the 2018, of course, big things happened during that year. But as we advance further, prior to the daily fantasy pick'ems of the monkey knife fights and the prize picks and Supreme Court ruling and all the crazy things that happened at the end of that decade, was there any other I guess golden nuggets of this chronological timeline that fit between where we kind of are in the story here at 2010 up until that stuff started coming into play?
Well, I mean, before that, you had the whole daily fantasy sports thing, which we could probably do a whole episode on in terms of
Yeah.
just all the legal stuff, and
Yeah.
obviously I was involved in that. But from the business side, that was kind of a trying time because you just didn't know if daily fantasy sports was really going to exist anymore. And if you go to like 2015, for example, that was a significant portion of RotoWire's business at the time, and so that. There's a time there where it was like, well, we're going to keep building these products, or we're going to keep doing this stuff, where FanDuel and DraftKings even exist. Obviously it worked pretty well, but yeah, that was kind of dicey. There's been a number of times like that where there's been some potential major changes of things, potentially getting wiped out or something like that. And the outcome that happened with states passing legislation and it becoming pretty clear that fantasy sports are legal games of skill in most states wasn't it wasn't like that wasn't predestined that it was going to happen. And if you look at the country of India, for example, this last year, India had a really robust daily fantasy sports and paid fantasy sports contest market, maybe the biggest in the world. And they just passed a law earlier this year that basically just banned all fantasy sports, and so they can only have contests for free anymore. And I like to point that out that we as an industry, all stuck together and worked really hard and really got our players and the people who are passionate about fantasy sports to call their legislators, and that paid off, because it might not have happened that way if you look at how it happened in India, say versus the U.S.
So I'm trying to make sure that I don't expedite this timeline to skip over very important pieces
Yeah.
of of your story. So just to kind of recap, early 2010s, FanDuel, DraftKings come out. I mean, and then everybody they eventually acquired came out. You are focusing heavily on the daily fantasy side of things. You're still doing your season long stuff. It's still everything RotoWire is doing is beneficial to pretty much anybody doing fantasy of any kind. And then we have towards the end of that decade again with the oncoming of now every state can legalize sports betting. When that became something, whether it was like the day that this Supreme Court ruling happened or leading up to that point, I guess the question would be, at what point were you like, holy crap, like this is actually going to happen and this is going to change like everything that's up to this point.
Yeah, I think one of the things about sports betting that people don't really realize at the time, who were not really watching it really closely, was just how kind of out of nowhere that 2018 Supreme Court ruling happened. A lot of people like to say, there's a lot of people who've written about daily fantasy sports and FanDuel and DraftKings, and they say, oh, the only reason that they started FanDuel and DraftKings was because they knew sports betting was going to happen, and these daily fantasy sports were just an afterthought. It was just a way, for sports betting. But that is just not the case at all because it was just, people thought maybe sports betting, could happen, that passbook could get overturned, or that, the federal government might pass, some sports betting stuff. But it was just such a distant thing, even up to 2015, 16, 17. The case that ultimately the Supreme Court picked up and overturned PASPA, which is the law that essentially limited sports betting in the U.S. to only Nevada. I mean, it had lost it'd been introduced in New Jersey, and then it got lost and appealed and lost again, and then appealed en banc, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And so the fact that the Supreme Court even picked it up was like really remote. It was something like, the numbers, if you go back and look at the number of cases that get picked up, it's like in the single digits. It's like 3, 4, 5% of those cases that have that path that, ever get picked up by the court. So really, until the Supreme Court decided to take up the PASPA case, um, it just wasn't, I don't think anyone really thought it was going to happen. But then once the case got picked up, it was like, okay, this is going to happen now because the Supreme Court is not going to pick up this case and hear it if they didn't really have a motivation or a reason. So at that point, it was like I think everybody in the industry was like, this is probably going to happen. And so that's put everything into motion where people in the industry started making plans and business plans and ideas for sports betting in the U.S. to become legal. And eventually, about 6 months, a year later, whatever it was, the Supreme Court overturned PASPA, and it was kind of off to the races. But it was really like, if you went back to 2017 and you asked anybody, what are the odds that sports betting is going to be legal in the U.S. outside of Nevada, in 2019, I think you would have gotten like, 2 or 3% chances or something like that. So it just kind of came out of nowhere. And luckily companies like ours who provide sports information, benefited, and it was quick. Obviously, it was a huge land rush, or to try to like win over the growing markets that were coming in all these individual states. And so we were, primed and ready for it, and that's why eventually we did a deal with gambling.com group when they purchased us because we were, uh, you know, we already had a great position in the U.S. in terms of, sports information and all of the kind of, information and tools and research that you need to also do well at sports betting.
So it's funny that you brought up the gambling.com thing because was literally my next question of how did that, I guess, how did that deal come to be? Were a lot of different entities seeing the success of RotoWire and then now seeing that sports betting is actually going to be a thing in the US and they're kind of like, uh, how many different entities, whoever they are, like we need to have RotoWire under our umbrella. Were you getting kind of like a lot of people saying like, are you looking to sell? Are you looking to sell? Or was it just both parties of RotoWire and gambling.com are just like, hey, this makes the most sense. Let's talk about this.
It was kind of all the above. I mean, there weren't a lot of established U.S. companies in the U.S. for, sports information, sports betting, that kind of stuff, or had really good, a lot of data, large database of users, a lot of followers, good brand. So we were right away one of the, companies, and we were independently owned, right? So, so we became a good target for a lot of people. but also just kind of the life cycle where we're at in terms of the founders and the company. It also just happened to be coincidentally a good time to sell. I mean, we've been doing this for 20 years and, we had kids are going to college, it's the kind of time where, some of my partners wanted to exit. And so it just kind of all came together. And, I knew people at gambling.com. I knew Charles Gillespie, the CEO from conferences, and he'd been on actually briefly been on the board of the FSTA then for a little while. So it was, I had a good feel for that company and the people involved, and it just kind of all came together really well. And it's been great. It's been a good. I'm still working here at RotoWire for gambling.com, going into my fifth year now, which I think is kind of rarity for an acquisition. It's been a very good partnership, relationship for both sides.
I think I was trying to refresh my memory on what exactly year that happened. So you said about 5 years. So right around the time we're talking about in the 2020 side of
Yeah, it's end of
things.
2021, so it's actually December of 2021.
So I guess the only other question I really have left here is after the acquisition, has your responsibilities or role changed at all within RotoWire? Are you simply doing the exact same thing you're doing prior to being bought?
I think it's largely the same. Still trying to make RotoWire the best site for fantasy sports and other, sports DFS, sports bet information. Trying to come up with new tools, trying to keep up with the technology. But obviously, it's in the context of a larger company. So, there's a lot of goals that the larger company has, or things that we probably wouldn't have done both most of them positive, some of them negative, if we were a smaller company. I mean, certainly there's a lot of, uh, you know, dots that we have to, things we have to cover that we wouldn't have as a small company that as a public company we do. So, but yeah, mostly the same. I mean, it's really still fun. It's still pretty much the same gang of people. It's still the same focus in terms of, how do I win my drafts? I'm doing baseball drafts right now. I'm using the RotoWire tools. What could be better? Where do we have a projection that's wrong? This new game format, we don't really quite have the data or analysis or articles that I need to win this game, or there's a new app technology that comes out. How can we start putting our stuff on that thing? So yeah, all that kind of stuff is still as much fun now as it was back in 1997. It's kind of the same. It's really not that dissimilar. And it's still really fun when you see a trade happen, and or some injury or whatever, and you have to, rush and put out the player out and figure out the analysis. How does this change this projection? What opportunities are there for me in fantasy sports to, capitalize on this trade or this, whatever the event is that I can suddenly now who am I starting, who am I picking up, who on my opponent's team am I trading for as a result? They're really not that much different now, even though so much has changed than it was back in 1997, which is what makes it fun, And there's obviously more ways to play and act on that information right now, and you can certainly win a lot more money than you could back then. But yes, at the same time, it's just not that much different, It's just every day is pretty fun that way.
So, the final question I like wrapping up the episodes with is talking about butterfly effects. So, butterfly effects are both things that are in your control and outside your control, different major life events that happen. If you were to attribute out of all of the ups and downs, out of all of the decisions you made or things that just happened you had to deal with, what do you attribute as the number one butterfly effect throughout your entire life that you most attribute to where you are today?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, I started my company with two guys I went to college with, so ending up at the college I'm in was probably pretty big. But like, if you were to say like, what makes us successful, just being super passionate and super tenacious about it. I mean, there's just so many times along the way of the story that we could have quit. It probably would have made sense to quit. I mean, we're making much money, made a really bad decision. The headwinds of the industry didn't look like it was going our direction. And we just stuck it out because we just loved it so much and figured out a way to make it work. And I think that you got to have a lot of that if you're going to be successful because it's just never easy. At some point you're just like, ugh, why am I doing this? Like what is the point? And even every business. I mean, if you named any business that we had, that has been mega successful. FanDuel, you name it. They've all had, if you look at their path, there's at some point similarly where if they were tenacious and just, really passionate about it, they would have gave up and moved on. And so that's really benefited us a lot.
All right. Well, that concludes our episode with you, Peter. We do appreciate your time sharing your story with us. If you guys are watching this on YouTube, the spelling of his name is right below his face. If you want to hit him up on LinkedIn, if you have anything you want to reach out with, feel free to. I can't promise he'll reply.
Oh, I will. I mean, hey, hit me up. I mean, it's one of the ways that I've helped build RotoWire and helped out the FSTA is just really just love talking to people, love talking about the business, love sharing success. Because one thing I've learned is that when you help somebody, it really helps grow the whole industry. And also you never know. I met two guys from England, UK, Northern Ireland, who came in and they were going to build some fancy football site, and I was like, good luck with that. And but I'll help you. I'll test it out. And I was one of the first guys that ever tested out FanDuel, and those guys became obviously the biggest thing ever. And I would have not said that they ever would have had a shot. But they were really smart, obviously really smart guys, and did a lot with it. So you just never know. So yeah, I love talking to people. So yeah, please reach out. Just Peter at rotowire.com. Love to hear from you.
All right. Well, definitely can attest to that because I'm pretty sure every time I see you, I pick your brain on something, whether it's industry or what I'm working on related. And you've definitely been helpful since I think I met you like, what, 5 or 6 years ago at this point. But again, if you guys enjoy this episode, we have a lot more. You can subscribe to this channel, whatever you're watching this on right now. Everything comes out in the future, drops on Tuesdays. Everything in the past is on the exact same channel you're watching this on. Peter, thanks again, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot.